On an old cassette recorder, I found the voice of a man who died before I was born. He knew my name, knew where I lived, and knew I would play the recording at exactly 3:17 a.m. The question is, how? My name is Miles Drew, and I'm a restorer. I bring old technology back to life, from reel-to-reel tape recorders to arcade machines from the 80s. This isn't about mysticism, it's about wires, circuit boards, the smell of dust and electrical contacts. I buy broken things at garage sales, take them apart, fix them, and sometimes find fragments of other people's stories inside. But what I found in the house on Fremont Avenue doesn't fit into any schematic or common sense. The late October rain pattered against the windows of my workshop as I examined the latest addition to my collection. The Panasonic RQ-2102, a cassette recorder from the early 80s, sat on my workbench under the warm glow of my lamp. I'd picked it up that morning from an estate sale in the old part of town, where the houses spoke of forgotten decades and unfulfilled promises. The owner of the house, an elderly woman named Mrs. Weston, was moving to hospice care, and her son was selling everything. Among the piles of junk, this recorder caught my eye. It was dusty but intact, with a cassette still inside, unmarked and mysterious. When I asked what was on it, her son just shrugged with a strange, distant look in his eyes. "This thing hasn't been turned on in 30 years, he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "If you get it working, don't be scared. We've tried throwing it away, but it always comes back somehow." I laughed it off as the ramblings of a stressed man dealing with his mother's possessions. I'd heard similar stories before, people attributing almost mystical qualities to old technology they didn't understand. Usually, there was a perfectly rational explanation: a recorder accidentally catching a radio frequency, a magnetic tape preserving a fragment of sound it shouldn't have. Physics, not phantoms. The next evening, after a day of client work, I finally had time to examine my new acquisition. My workshop, a converted garage behind my small craftsman house in Millfield, was my sanctuary. Shelves lined with vintage electronics in various states of repair covered the walls. A large workbench dominated the center of the room, illuminated by an adjustable lamp that cast warm light over my current projects. I carefully opened the battery compartment of the recorder. The previous batteries had thankfully been removed before they could leak and damage the contacts. I inserted fresh ones, feeling the satisfying click as they locked into place. The cassette was still inside, no label, no markings, just a standard Type 1 ferric oxide tape in a black plastic shell. My curiosity piqued, I pressed play. The recorder's motor whirred to life, the sound of the mechanical parts engaging sending a wave of satisfaction through me. This was what I lived for, bringing dormant technology back to life, hearing the voices of machines long silenced. Then, a man's voice emerged from the speaker. Raspy but confident, he spoke evenly, as if reading from a script. "Miles. If you're hearing this, it means I did everything right. Don't turn it off. Just listen to the end. And don't look out the window when I tell you." I immediately hit pause, my heart racing. How did he know my name? This had to be some kind of prank. Maybe the son had researched me, found out I was a restorer, and recorded this as a joke. It wasn't impossible, I had a small website advertising my services. To verify, I removed the cassette and played it on another device, a Walkman I'd restored last month. The recording was identical. No signs of editing, no digital processing. Just a pure analog signal. Confused but intrigued, I put it back in the original recorder and pressed play again. It's 3:14 now. You're in your workshop, alone. It's dark outside, but you're checking anyway, aren't you? Don't check. I've already tried. I know how it ends when you try to see what comes before the signal. I glanced up at the digital clock on my desk, 3:14 a.m. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn temperature. I hadn't realized how late it had gotten. I'd been working for hours, lost in the puzzle of circuitry and mechanics. Unconsciously, I turned toward the window. The blinds were drawn, but a gap revealed only darkness. Nothing there, but my stomach tightened nonetheless. The voice continued. When I was you, I made a mistake. I opened the door. Don't open it. I've left everything you need inside the cassette. Just listen to the end. The sound cut off abruptly, as if someone had suddenly inhaled. Then another voice. The same, yet different, distorted, as if run through a slow analog filter. Miles, you're listening to yourself. The one who came before. But not the first. And not the last. The recorder shut off by itself. I ejected the cassette, it had rewound to the beginning automatically. I hadn't done that. The sensation of another presence filled the room. I checked the door, locked. I reviewed my security camera footage, everything normal, until I reached the segment at 3:17 a.m. There was a shadow by the window. Just for a second. Too large for a human. Then a signal failure, as if the camera had been suddenly unplugged, but the cord was intact. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the recorder's voice replaying in my mind. The next morning, I began researching Mr. Weston, the husband of the elderly woman. Online archives of the local newspaper yielded a fragment of an article from 1989, Thomas Weston, electronics engineer, missing. Last recording, a voice message addressed to himself. Claim that, time can be looped if you catch the right frequency. My professional skepticism battled with growing unease. As a restorer, I dealt in the tangible, broken wires, burned-out capacitors, faulty switches. Not mysterious recordings that knew my name and the time. I called Detective Sandra Marquez, an acquaintance who had bought a restored jukebox from me last year. We met at Cora's Diner, a local spot with checkerboard floors and the best coffee in 3 counties. Missing person from 1989. She sipped her coffee, eyebrows raised. That's a cold case if I ever heard one. I know it sounds strange, I said, keeping my voice low despite the nearly empty diner. But there's something about this recorder that doesn't add up. She sighed, placing her mug down. I can pull the file, but don't get your hopes up. Cases that old, the files might be incomplete or missing altogether. Anything would help, I insisted. His name was Thomas Weston, engineer, disappeared in '89. 2 days later, Sandra called me. I found something, but it's weird. Weston's case file is mostly empty. Just a note saying evidence was checked out in 2004 by someone named Miles Drew. That's impossible, I said, my voice barely a whisper. In 2004, I was still in high school in Arizona. Well, someone using your name checked out those files. There's a signature and everything. I asked her to send me a picture of the signature. When it arrived, my blood ran cold. It was my handwriting. Exactly my signature, down to the peculiar way I crossed the T in Drew. That night, I turned on the recorder again. This time, a different voice emerged, female, calm but urgent. If you're hearing my voice, it means he's not inside yet. You can still turn back. Remember, 3:17 isn't a time. It's an entry point. I checked both sides of the cassette. On the other side was a recording that sounded like shortwave radio noise. I ran it through spectral analysis software on my computer. At a frequency of 1800 Hz, a voice emerged. Miles, stop. You're not restoring technology. You're restoring a signal. And the signal is a door. You're already at the threshold. I considered destroying the cassette. I pulled out the tape, held a lighter to it, watched it melt and curl. But the next morning, it was back in the recorder. Only now, there was a label with my name on it. And a date, tomorrow. The next day, I visited Mrs. Weston at the hospice. She was frail, her skin translucent, but her eyes were surprisingly alert. When I mentioned the recorder, she tensed. Thomas's recorder, she whispered. He should have left it alone. What happened to him? I asked, leaning closer. He was brilliant. Too brilliant. Always working with frequencies, signals. Said there were messages everywhere if you knew how to listen. She gripped my hand with surprising strength. The night he disappeared, he called me. Said he'd found a way to send messages backward. That time wasn't linear but looped. I thought he was having a breakdown. And the recorder? It was his favorite. Always carried it. After he vanished, it kept showing up, no matter where I hid it. Her eyes grew distant. Sometimes, I'd hear voices coming from it, even when it was turned off. Different voices. Sometimes a child. Sometimes an old man. Once it was my voice, saying things I'd never said. I left the hospice more confused than when I'd arrived. That evening, I contacted Dr. Eleanor Chen, a professor of quantum physics at the local university whom I had met at a technology convention last year. Theoretical time loops, she said over coffee in her cluttered office the next day. That's more science fiction than science. But. She hesitated. But what? There's been some interesting work in quantum mechanics. The idea that information could, theoretically, travel backward is not entirely dismissed. It violates no known laws of physics if we consider time as another dimension rather than a linear progression. Could someone send a voice backward in time? I asked, feeling slightly ridiculous. She looked thoughtful. Sound is just vibrations, waves. And waves exist across the electromagnetic spectrum. If someone found a way to modulate those waves across time instead of just space. She shook her head. It's highly speculative. But interesting. When I returned home, I found my front door ajar. Nothing was missing, but the recorder had been moved from my workshop to the kitchen table. I hadn't brought it inside the house. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the recorder turned on by itself. Even without a cassette. Even without batteries. A new voice each time. Once a child. Another time an old man. Once, my own voice, but aged, changed by decades I hadn't yet lived. It said. Everything you think you've perceived. Nothing is yours. All signal. The question is, whose? That night, I dreamed of standing in a circular room, surrounded by recorders of different eras, wax cylinders, wire recorders, reel-to-reels, cassettes, digital devices. Each played the same message in different voices. The loop is not perfect. Errors compound. Each iteration changes slightly. I woke with a start at 3:17 a.m., the recorder playing in the dark. Miles, you're the control group. The one who might break the pattern. The next day, I returned to Mrs. Weston's house. It was already on the market, but I convinced the realtor to let me look around. The basement was what I wanted to see. According to the file Sandra had found, Thomas Weston had converted it into a home laboratory. The basement was mostly empty now, but marks on the concrete floor suggested heavy equipment had once stood there. In the corner, behind an old water heater, I found a metal box. Inside was a journal and a hand-drawn schematic labeled Frequency Modulator, Temporal Variance. Thomas Weston's journal detailed his experiments with what he called chronoresonance, the theory that certain frequencies could resonate across time, creating nodes where information could pass backward. His last entry read: Success. Signal transmitted. But the feedback loop is unstable. Each transmission creates variations in the timeline. I'm no longer certain which version is original. Am I creating new timelines or merely discovering existing ones? Tomorrow's test will be definitive. I'll send my voice to a specific point to intercept myself. There was no entry after that. That night, I set up recording equipment around the Panasonic. At 3:17 a.m., it activated again. This time, multiple voices spoke in unison. Miles Drew. Iteration 317. You are both receiver and transmitter. The cycle continues until one breaks it. Will you? I spoke back, for the first time. How do I break it? The recorder fell silent, then a single voice, Thomas Weston's original voice, replied. Find the original frequency. The pure signal. Before it was corrupted by repetition. The next day, I built a device based on Weston's schematics, a frequency analyzer capable of identifying harmonic patterns across unrelated recordings. I connected it to the recorder and played all the messages I'd captured. The device displayed a swirling pattern, numbers shifting and changing, until they stabilized on a single frequency, 317 Hz. Not 317. 317 Hz. I modified the device to generate this exact frequency. As it hummed to life, the recorder started playing by itself. A cacophony of voices, all the previous recordings simultaneously, creating a wall of unintelligible sound. Then clarity, as a single voice emerged, my voice, but not as I knew it. The frequency is the key. Not to send. To end. Turn it off, Miles. All of them. Every iteration keeps the door open. What if we're just end devices, and someone has been testing which of us will understand that they're not the first? And here's what's strange. Since then, every day at exactly 3:17 a.m., my recorder turns on by itself. Even without a cassette. Every time, a new voice. Once a child. Another time an old man. Once my own voice, but older. It said. Everything you think you've perceived. Nothing is yours. All signal. The question is, whose? I've tried destroying the recorder multiple times. It always returns. I've moved 3 times. It follows. I've played the 317 Hz tone continuously, thinking it might block whatever signal is coming through. Sometimes it works for a few days. Then the voices return. Last night, I heard a new voice. My own, but different somehow, as if from a timeline where my life took another path. Miles, there are thousands of us. All hearing the voices. All trying to break the loop. But what if the loop is the point? What if we're meant to listen, not escape? Today, I found a package on my doorstep. Inside was another recorder, newer, digital. When I turned it on, it contained a single message in my voice, but with words I've never spoken. Time isn't linear or looped. It's networked. Every point connects to every other point. We're not trapped in time. We're trapped in signal. I don't know if I'm restoring technology anymore, or if the technology is restoring something in me, some understanding beyond conventional physics. All I know is that at 3:17 a.m., I'll be listening. And recording. Adding my voice to the network, hoping someone else in another time hears it and understands what I'm only beginning to grasp. What if we're just end devices, and someone has been testing which of us will understand that they're not the first?